I am deeply honored to be here. Honored to be in the home of the Blackfoot people and all the creatures of this marvelous province. Very grateful to Robin Gailey for her invitation to speak here, for Dave Weber having gathered the roundtable community. A family of people that I instantly fell in love with 6.5 years ago and started right up again tonight at dinner. And to David Finch for his love of mountains. 6 years ago, I spent that marvelous weekend up at the Goldeye Center in Nordegg with these hikers. So I know I'm surrounded by backpackers and mountain lovers here. All of the saints gathered. Tonight I thought I'd share with you some thoughts from a new book I've just finished, coming from Oxford University Press this spring. It'll be my last book with an academic press at least, titled The Great Conversation, Nature and the Care of the Soul. I've handed out we've handed out a diagram of the book's structure that we might be able to talk about a little later if you'd like, showing how it examines 12 different teachers in the natural world, from birds and wolves to canyons and islands, asking what each of them have to tell us about the spiritual life, especially as viewed through the eyes of a sage or saint who paid special attention to them. In each chapter, I write about a backpacking trip that intimately connected me with both the teacher and the saint, asking also how they might serve as guides through the 4 stages of our lives as children, adolescents, adults, and elders. My conviction is that there are spiritual teachers out there who can guide us through all the passages of our lives. We need to pay more attention to them. Tonight in particular, I'd like us to look at caves in connection with St. Ignatius Loyola and what the two have to suggest for the eldering years of our lives. Having taught for 35 years at a Jesuit university, I've been deeply influenced by Ignatian spirituality. And at the age of 75 now, I'm fully launched on my role as an elder. Let me begin with a story about caves. The Yaqui Indians in the Sonoran Desert of southern Arizona tell of a sacred cave on the slopes of the Red Mountain, Sicalcawe. It's hard to find this mythical place. The opening is no bigger than a small fox den. You have to squeeze yourself into a narrow passageway between the rocks, moving into the darkness. As you get further in, you sit down on a log to rest, but the log turns into a snake that wraps itself around you. Wherever you look, wild animals move in the shadows, old memories of things you have feared all your life. But if you show no terror, an old man leads you into an inner cavern where any talent, any gift you might ever have wanted can be seen hanging from the walls. You can choose whatever you desire. Maybe it's the gift of being a writer or a storyteller, the talent of playing the flute or carving masks, the art of training horses or being able to make yourself invisible. You only have to know what you want. And even that knowledge can grow out of the darkness there. Now, when you leave, you pass by a pit full of rattlesnakes. And in that moment, if you yield to your fear, if you try to deny the frightening and broken places in your life, your fear will change you into one of those animals you've seen in the cave. But if you get back to the world again, and one can never be sure, if you carry with you the fearlessness you found, as well as the gift that you chose, you'll then have the freedom to practice that gift with alacrity for the rest of your life. According to Yaqui wisdom, appropriating your gift is a matter of handling your terror. Isn't that interesting? Now in Scripture, A cave in the ground is often a place where death is encountered and overcome, where fears are faced and put to rest. You have Elijah fleeing from Jezebel to the cave on Mount Horeb, where he hears the still small voice of God and recovers his courage. Jesus stands before the cave tomb where Lazarus had been buried. He shouts, "Lazarus, come forth!" And Mary and Martha's fears are transformed forever. Moses hides in the cave or cleft of the rock, the only safe place where he could see God passing by without dying of the shock of such glory. 3 summers ago, I was backpacking in southern Missouri in an area known for its karst geography, filled with limestone caves. There are 6,400 caves in the state of Missouri, with folk tales of giant cave bears lurking inside, moonshiners making illegal whiskey, bandit gangs like Jesse James and the Dalton brothers. I spent the night in one of those caves alone, down in Ripley County near the Arkansas line, a winding limestone passageway that burrows into the mountainside. I wasn't doing anything technical like speleologists or cave scientists sometimes do. Yet I'd gone prepared for the experience, or so I thought. I had the required 3 sources of light that you need for caving: a helmet, knee pads, clothing to keep me warm and dry. I was careful to avoid any side passages that where I might get lost, and to keep my head down as I crawled through narrow places. This cave goes back about 1,000 meters and continues in an underwater passageway even beyond that. Scuba divers are still exploring to see how far back it may go. I went in about 300 meters, far enough so I couldn't see my hand in front of my face, and spent the night there alone in the dark. I had misgivings about a night alone in a space 2 meters high, 3 meters wide, and a third of a kilometer deep. But I was taking a lot of inner baggage along with me at the time as well, struggling with my faith once again, coming to terms with this enigmatic figure of Jesus who had haunted me all of my life. Going underground into complete darkness is probably the last place you want to go in wrestling with God. Now, this particular cave had been carved out by an underground spring-fed stream. The sound of moving water echoed down the corridors like distant voices, water dripping everywhere. There were stalactites hanging down from the ceiling and stalagmites reaching up from the floor. There were blind cave fish swimming in the dark water, albino salamanders you could see through, bats clinging to the roof. The cave's complete absence of light was unsettling. An experienced Missouri caver put it this way: it's not unlike a black liquid. Darkness has a life of its own. It stalks you. It crawls and creeps around you as you move. At every opportunity, it seems to sweep up and cling to your back. Are any of you spelunkers? I'm sure there are caves here in Alberta, the wonderful ones. Caves have always fascinated us. In science and in mythic tales alike, they are places where frightening things lurk and places where we might hide from frightening things. They come in all shapes and sizes. Solution caves, like the one where I camped, are formed by water cutting its way through limestone rock. Mammoth Cave in Kentucky is the best example of this. It's the longest cave in the world, with 360 miles of mapped passages going 5 levels deep into the earth. Then there are sea caves, carved out by ocean waves on the Pacific coast. There are lava tube caves, formed by flowing volcanic lava in Hawaii and California. And even glacier caves, like this one in the Athabasca Glacier at Jasper National Park. Part of the mystery of caves is that they carry us back into deep time. At Lascaux in southern France, archaeologists have found Paleolithic cave paintings of mysterious horses and stags over 17,000 years old. But the Garbenmung Cave in Australia's Northern Territory has paintings over 35,000 years old. It has a virtual Sistine Chapel ceiling covered with images of crocodiles, kangaroos, and other sacred figures from the dream time of creation. In some cultural traditions, caves play an important part in creation stories. The Hopi Indians in Arizona speak of the first people as emerging from underground, from a hole in the roof of the underworld. Their kivas are cave-like places dug into the earth for conducting sacred rituals. In each of these, there's a hole in the center of the dirt floor. The sapapu, you can just barely see it on the far side of the ladder foot. That symbolizes the original place of emergence where the first people came from underground. Plato spoke of the cave as a place of darkness where we're chained, longing for life. St. Benedict lived in a cave for 3 years in the mountains south of Rome before beginning to organize his monastic community. Muhammad, in a cave on Mount Hira, heard the voice of the angel Gabriel reciting the words of the Holy Quran. The cave is a place of illumination where new wisdom emerges. It's a portal between worlds. Bilbo Baggins went into the cave to find the dragon's hidden treasure. Now, Ignatius Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, had a formative cave experience of his own at a significant turning point in his life. He was born in 1491 in northern Spain to a family of the Basque nobility. The Basques have a long history of pride in their distinctive language and culture. They claim, in fact, that Basque was the first language spoken by Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. The devil himself studied it for 7 years, though he never learned more than 3 words. As a teenager, Ignatius' father sent him to the royal court, where he flourished as a promising young knight. His friends called him Inigo. They loved him for his wit and reckless exuberance. He had an eye for the ladies and a readiness to fight at the drop of a hat. When the French invaded the nearby town of Pamplona in 1521, he sprang to its defense, rallying his men atop the walls. But he was wounded by cannon fire that completely shattered one of his legs. He would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. While recovering from multiple surgeries, he read the lives of the saints and experienced a dramatic conversion. He decided to become a soldier for Christ and to begin his new quest by making a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. He got as far as the little town of Manresa, near Barcelona on the coast. But that's where everything fell apart. He passed through a dark night of the soul, staying there for almost a year, living in a cave for part of that time, and starting to write his spiritual exercises. It was a limestone cave near the River Cardonner, just outside the village. From its opening, he could see the sawtoothed ridge of Montserrat 10 miles away. That's where he had stopped on his way there, leaving his sword and dagger behind him, praying all night before the Mary altar at the Benedictine Abbey on the mountain slopes. And here at Manresa, the 3 great symbols of the mountain, the river, and the cave came together for him. He had always aspired for the mountain heights. striving to be the most impressive knight at court, the bravest soldier, and now he thought he'd become the best of all the saints. But he quickly realized that he had to come down from the mountain and into the cave. He had to face the river's work in carving out the canyon of his inner life. His 3 months in the cave at Manresa would be the hardest period of his life, undercutting the bedrock of everything he had known. But it was also a time for the birthing of something altogether new. Inigo experienced a breakdown at Manresa, passing through thorns and thistles along the riverbank into his dark cave. For the first time in his life, he found himself without an admiring audience, with no one to impress by his reputation, falling into a deep depression over the hollowness of what his life had been and uncertainty as to whatever might be coming next. He feared that God could never forgive him for all his past sins. He was tempted to commit suicide, to throw himself into a crevasse deep inside the cave. But then there's a breakthrough into something new. Inigo had always been a man given to his senses. Beautiful women, fine clothes, the taste of good wine, the thrill of hand-to-hand fighting. And it's curious that God now speaks to him through the sensory impact of the surrounding landscape. He has several visions during his time there. The most vivid one, what he later describes as the single most powerful experience of his whole life, comes as he sits by the river near the mouth of the cave, looking out onto the mountains. He's suddenly aware of being surrounded by beauty. The eyes of his understanding began to open, he said. He perceives the whole of creation in a new light, seeing God in all things, a central theme that he would develop through the rest of his life. He reflected on the various layers of wonder that one can trace through the natural world. He saw God in the very existence of the elements of rock and water around him, in the flowering life and diversity of plants, in the sensate feeling of animals, and in the sparkling intelligence of human beings. Each of these steps led him in the end to an awareness of himself too, as a dwelling place of the Most High God. He also receives a vision of Jesus at this time. Jesus is profoundly important for this man. He sees him in all of his humanity, he says. The God he learns to love here is anchored in this worldly sensory experience, in God become flesh. It's not abstract ideas about Jesus that persuade him, but specific and earthy images of a God alive in this world. He wants to go to Jerusalem, for example, so he can touch and see the actual places where this man had lived, this new captain now demanding his loyalty. It's in this world that he longs to witness the divine, in his own sensory experience, in his own body. So out of this cave experience at Manresa, a new fearlessness emerges, a courage based not on Basque machismo and romantic chivalry, but on his confidence that the world is filled with God's glory and that it dwells in him as well. This gives him a new kind of warrior energy, if you will, leading him to found the Company of Jesus, the Jesuit community. It's also interesting that the cave is the place where Inigo starts writing notes for his spiritual exercises. These are explicit directions for companioning others in the spiritual life, ideally over a period of 30 days given to prayer and reflection. He organizes the exercises into 4 weeks or 4 movements. In the first week, he takes his retreatants through a time of purgation and release, acknowledging the broken, wounded places within them. what he'd encountered himself in the cave. And this leads in the second week to a decision-making point in their lives when they choose between two standards, deciding who it is they will serve, what choices they need to make in their lives at that time. And then in weeks 3 and 4, he carries his directees into an intensive, deeply sensuous reading of the gospel stories of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. There in the cave, Jesus had become the core reality of Inigo's life. And he insists that the sensory reality of the place is crucial in all the gospel narratives. It's what allows you to make the Jesus story your own, using your imagination to insert yourself into the place and the narrative. Take the cave at Bethlehem. He says, for example, where a very pregnant Mary comes with her frightened husband that night. You smell the mustiness where animals have been kept. You see a pile of straw thrown on a hay rack nearby. You maybe imagine yourself as a servant girl hiding behind the harnesses and mule blankets, eager to help if she's needed. In short, Inigo says, the extent to which you make the story your own depends on your ability to perceive it as actually happening in the real sensory world. This profoundly incarnational character of the Gospels is a primary concern for him. The nativity story he knows happens to a couple of homeless immigrants on the margins of society. You got to imagine it in all its gritty, down-to-earth particularity, Inigo insists. Have some of you been through the exercises? Wonderful, a couple of you. One of the most profound experiences of re-entering the scriptures that my wife and I have ever experienced. Now, if the cave is a symbol of being deeply grounded, rooted in the earth and the people of the land who work it, I want to suggest that it also symbolizes the stage of the elder in the spiritual life. You think of the Hindu sage, the sannyasin, sitting in the mouth of a mountain cave, drawn deeply into wisdom. The elder, the crone, has wisdom because she incorporates as her own all the earlier stages of her life experience. She looks back with delight on the child who reaches for the heights, climbing trees. She understands the adolescent's difficulty in controlling fiery passion. She sympathizes with the harried souls at midlife who long to be able to flow like a river without hectic anxiety. But she and the other white hairs belong to the earth. They summon us to care for its life for all the generations yet to come. Over the last 15 years, I've been working with men as elders, helping to lead men's rites of passage in wilderness settings. This grows out of Richard Rohr's work that I've found so powerful. Our aim is to assist men as they move into the second half of life, and more recently in having rites for young men, and this a week and a half ago, our first effort at an elder's rites of passage. Asking what it means to live for more than just a career as a man. How to move into the wisdom, the compassion, and the freedom of an elder in our society. God knows we don't have enough men. We don't begin to have enough men like that in my country as well as in yours. Let me emphasize 3 particular things that elders do, both men and women, as they draw from the wisdom of the cave. The first thing that marks the elders is that they aren't afraid of the dark anymore. They've learned how to befriend the night. Barbara Brown Taylor's book, Learning to Walk in the Dark, cuts against the grain of most traditional Christian spiritual writing, at least in a popular vein, We usually think of darkness as a matter of sin, ignorance, spiritual blindness, death, and we want to avoid all of that as much as possible. But Barbara says that the dark calls us into the cave of contemplative silence, a practice of contemplation, of entering into darkness, of silence in our lives. It's where we don't have all the answers, maybe any of the answers, where we wrestle with God's absence, which sometimes proves a deeper way of discerning God's presence. It's where you go to die so that you might live again. She makes an important distinction, by the way, between pastoral counseling and spiritual direction. We go to counselors, she says, when we want help getting out of caves. We go to directors when we are ready to be led further in. Isn't that wonderful? We go to counselors when we want help getting out of caves. We go to directors when we're ready to be led further in. Our culture tells us, though, to be terrified of the dark places, wary of the silence and solitude of the cave. It's safer to stay busy, keep the lights on, turn the music up, and pretend we have all the answers. The real problem, says Barbara Taylor, has far less to do with what is really out there in the dark than it does with our resistance to finding out what is really out there. Suffering comes from our reluctance to learn to walk in the dark. So what about your own experience? Your own resistance, maybe, to the dark, still place where you meet God or have met God in the past. When was the last time, let me ask each of you, when was the last time you spent 24 hours alone and in silence in a small room, a hermitage somewhere, a cabin in the woods, better yet, a tent out on the trail? One of the best things any of us can do is to maintain a personal cave to which we regularly retreat. A prayer closet, a dark nook under a staircase, a Christ room that you've set aside. The Russian Orthodox call it a pustynia, an intentionally desert place into which you withdraw. Now for me, it's a cavity in grandfather's side. Grandfather is a 100-year-old cottonwood tree who lives in the park across the street from my house. For many years now, he's been my most important spiritual director, the central figure in this new book, in fact. He's been my most important teacher in leading me into the natural world and to God's presence in it. Every night I go over, I stand or sit in the wound of his side in a contemplative practice that is the most important thing that keeps me alive. A second mark, the first mark of the elder then, is that she is not afraid of the dark. Not so much anymore. And the second mark of the elder is that elders also are holders of the tradition. They know what is worth holding on to. They remind us of the treasure that lies hidden in the cave of our collective memory. The elders show us how to reclaim the past with a new life for today. Now, I want to stretch you a little bit here, because my trip into that cave that night down in southern Missouri was very much about my going back to the roots of what I believe, rediscovering Jesus in a new way for me. Given the nature of my work over the years, my thinking about God has tended to focus on the cosmic Christ, perceiving the divine presence as pervading and enlivening the whole of the universe. The cosmic Christ is what New Testament writers see Jesus to have become in his resurrection. He's the radiant light of God's glory, sustaining the universe by God's powerful command, says Hebrews 1:3. This is a universal reality, much wider than just Christianity or any single faith tradition. The Apostle Paul in Colossians 1 says, the cosmic Christ was before all things, and in him all things hold together. We're talking about a Christology here that is global in significance, universal in significance. This is the core of my thinking about the world and of my faith. And yet, because of my upbringing, growing up in the South in a fundamentalist setting, I've always struggled with knowing what to do with Jesus. In my early experience, Jesus was a powerful and largely otherworldly figure, coming often with judgment. He had come to take us away from this sinful world of the devil. We used to sing a gospel song, "This world is not my home, I'm just a passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue. I want to get out of here as quickly as possible." This also was a Jesus who loved only those who had had a particular kind of conversion experience and strictly believed in him. And all the people who didn't have that, including me, I feared, were going to hell. So through the years, I came to appreciate an all-embracing Christ of the universe, but to resist a tribal, exclusivist Jesus who held unbelieving sinners in the hands of an angry God. I could delight in the cosmic Christ. It was Jesus I stumbled over. Later, when I became a scholar, trained in critical thinking, I was tempted to look at Jesus as a relatively obscure figure in first century Palestine, very different from what Christians later made of him. And yet, all the while through the years, I felt guilty about having betrayed the faith of my youth, giving up on Jesus. So as I thought of going into the cave, back into the shadows of my earlier spiritual life, I feared the specter of encountering this Jesus once again. A Jesus prone to judgment, rebuking my departure from the straight and narrow path of my childhood. In the back of my mind, I still associated Jesus with a threatening God who demanded blind faith, punishing for my doubts in asking any questions. I was surprised by how much residual fear I still had in thinking of going into that cave. But then the night before I left on the trip, I went over to see Grandfather. I love this tree. I've known him for 25 years, intimately. I leaned into his trunk, and I heard him say to me, "You know, Belden, there's nothing for you to be afraid of in going into that dark cave tomorrow. Who have you been meeting every night all these years and coming over here to be with me, if not Jesus? You stand in the wound of his side every night. My bark, his flesh, same difference." I heard the tree saying, "You know, Jesus is just like me, wounded, and yet showing love to all others who suffer." He loved most, in fact, the ones who'd been left out altogether, dismissed. He went to hell even to rescue those without any hope whatever. I thought of those marvelous Eastern Orthodox icons of Jesus' descent into hell. Jesus, in his death, enters the cave of outer darkness on that Holy Saturday. He enters the utter despair of the hopeless, and he meets them with love. And there's just marvelous images from the Greek and Russian tradition. of Jesus blasting down the doors, standing on the broken hinges and scattered keys, and he takes by the hand those who had been condemned and leads them out. This is what the old tree was saying to me. And suddenly the cosmic Christ and the loving Jesus came together for me in a new way I hadn't recognized before. The one holding everything together in a cosmic unity, and the other suffering out of love with every individual part. The universal and the particular. The two now seen as one. This is the Jesus Ignatius had experienced too, alive in every one of us. In fact, grandfather, my tree, went on that night to say something still more astounding to me. He said, you know what's even more outrageous than my showing you Jesus? It's not your doubts about whether Jesus was divine. It's the question, if you can imagine this, of whether you are divine as well. Just like me, all of us reflecting God's glorious image, the holy made real in every one of us, all to the greater glory of God. That's what I heard the tree saying. And the next day, as I walked into the cave, I went without any fear whatever, realizing that Jesus had been inside all along, in the cave and in me as well. Now, this is what the Christian mystics speak of as the mystery of theosis, our becoming divine, entering fully into the image and likeness of God. We read in 2 Peter 1:4 that our destiny is to become partakers of the divine nature, able to say with Paul that it's no longer I, but Christ who lives in me. Like Athanasius in the 4th century, who said the Son of God became human so that we might become God. I'm increasingly able to grasp a little of this mystery as I hold my 2-year-old granddaughter, our first grandchild, seeing God in her so easily. Here the two of us are standing inside the cavity, the wound of grandfather, the tree. Jean Houston is an archetypal psychologist who in some of her workshops uses a exercise called Are You God in Hiding? She works with 100 people or more in a large, dimly lit ballroom, asking them to close their eyes and to wander slowly around the room. Whenever they run into someone else, they are to ask softly, Are you God in hiding? And the other person responds, asking the same question back, Are you God in hiding? And they keep going on to more and more people asking the same question. Now, Jean previously has assigned the role of God to one person in the group. And when you run into that person asking, Are you God in hiding? You get no response. He or she is silent. And by their silence, you become God as well. And it's a signal for you to remain silent too when other people come up to ask you, Are you God in hiding? Gradually, she says, a stillness spreads across the entire room. It never takes more than a minute or two, she says, for 100 people or more to come to complete silence, in awe at the fact that God is there in every one of them. Can you imagine waking up tomorrow morning, looking at yourself in the mirror and asking, Are you God in hiding? Are you the reality of Jesus moving into the world this day? And then answering simply with silence and a smile. When was the last time you smiled at yourself in a mirror? Finally, a last mark of the elders is that they are free to exercise a countercultural prophetic role in speaking truth to power. knowing this presence of the holy within them. They don't worry anymore about what other people think. You know, you get old enough, you don't have to worry about what everybody else thinks about you. Many of them died off anyway. These elders can speak out as old men and fiery women who exercises a voice that speaks without fear. Having known the fear of God and knowing it as love, they aren't intimidated by anything else. They call us today to denounce the crippling fear that characterizes our world as we hunker down against all the perceived threats to our safety. We have fear-mongers at the highest places of power today, in my country especially, tempting us to panic before the encroaching forces of darkness. I'm convinced that fear is the greatest danger, the greatest single danger in the world right now, more dangerous than ISIS, the Islamic State, or all other terrorists. Giving ourselves to fear will undo us, says the elders, making us terrified of all the others, immigrants, people of color, people of different sexual orientation, anyone different from us. So we build walls, we withdraw into gated communities, we buy guns, preparing ourselves to hurt others before they hurt us. But what the elders do is to call us on our self-protective fearfulness. They invite us to cut against the grain of our culture, to face the dark cave of terror within our own hearts. Let me close with a story that speaks powerfully to this need, coming out of the savannas of East Africa. The Maasai people who live in the Serengeti Desert of Tanzania know that the lions of the Serengeti love to hunt the gazelle as their favorite prey. But the gazelle are fast, and the lions aren't always fast enough to catch them. So what the lions sometimes do is to divide themselves into two groups. They have the old lions lie down in high grass, while the younger ones circle around behind the gazelle and start them running in the direction of the old ones hidden in the brush. The old lions, of course, aren't very fast, and they pose very little threat to the gazelle, but they can still roar like hell. There's some things that old farts are still good for. So when the old lions see the gazelle running toward them, they wait for just the right moment and then suddenly stand up and they roar for all that they're worth. And the gazelle, startled by this new and unexpected threat, follow their instinct, of course, to stop and freeze and then run in the opposite direction away from what they fear. And in the process, obviously, they run right into the young lions coming up behind them. The irony is that if they had kept running into their fear instead of away from it, they would have escaped. The old lions couldn't have done much more than roar. Like the gazelle, our impulse in the dark, cave-like times of our lives is to freeze in the face of fear and to run the other way, imagining that we too are helpless in the headlights of paralyzing terror. The elders remind us that we don't have to freeze. We are set free to act, to choose, to move, as Ignatius would say, through contemplation into action, through love, through fear into love. That's the core of Ignatian spirituality. A life of prayer leading to authentic change in the world. God knows today, in the face of overpowering fear, we need more voices for peace, more ears to hear the earth's cry for sustainability, and more hearts open to the plight of immigrants and marginalized people everywhere. We have to work for justice and peace as the natural outcome of any authentic spirituality. So my friends, the Holy Spirit summons us this day to a fearless and joyous celebration of a world shot through with God's glory. May we be overwhelmed by this vision and set free to be the love of Christ in the world. Amen. Amen.